Hello there, Nebula Scholar here. Trying out something new. Don't know how many I'll do, if they'll all be commentary reviews, or if I'll just talk about whatever I feel like. Either way, let's get into this. Bright Memory Infinite is a first-person shooter, stylus action, parkour hybrid game, created by a one-man developer. Now, when you hear that mix of genres, your reaction is either along the lines of, "That sounds awesome, everything I'd want," or, "That's too much, it can't do all of that." Before I played it, I was in the camp of the former. After playing it, I'm more on the side of the latter. It has gunplay, swordplay, aerial combos, force powers, double jumping, dashing, sliding, wall running, deflection, parries, grapple hooks, a whole bunch of stuff. The action is intense, the moves are cool, and as a whole, the game looks beautiful. It's a concept I, and many others, can really get behind. The problem is, a lot of it ends up being fluff. Wall running and grappling are just used in platforming and traversals. The game seems conflicted on how to balance the core mechanics of gunfighting, sword defense, and exo powers. The options don't particularly mesh as well as they should, and their effectiveness against certain enemies varies wildly. Don't get me wrong, the game functions very well as a proof of concept, and I'd say as an experience, I enjoyed it. But overall, there's a web of flaws that hold this game back from being the game it wants to be. Now, I'm not a game designer, and I only have a rudimentary understanding of game design theory. But as a guy who plays video games, I'd say I have a pretty good sense of what feels good or right. Most of the time, at least. Overall, I'd have a hard time saying Bright Memory Infinite is a good or even complete game. I'm not even talking about how the game clocks in at an average of 2 hours to clear. I mean, I played it on Revenge, which is hard mode but not the hardest mode, and it still only took me 4 hours to clear, primarily due to ridiculously hard fights, not due to the game's pacing. I'm also not talking about the more obvious bugs and effects that are found throughout the game. I mean, there are a good many design choices that feel half-baked or outright clash with other mechanics, even from a layman's perspective. These issues are pretty intertwined between mechanics, so I'm just going to start somewhere and risk overlap. Let's start with the health system. In Bright Memory Infinite, health regenerates after not receiving damage for a few seconds, a similar system to the one popularized by Halo 2. In a vacuum, this sort of health system works fine. I mean, I know it has its detractors, but for my opinion, it works fine in other games it's in. Unfortunately for Bright Memory, I don't think it was the right call. At least not entirely the right call. Regenerating health functions in games like Halo or Call of Duty due to the comparatively slower, cover-based combat. You're meant to stop and take a break in order to breathe, collect yourself, and recover. In fact, in the segments in Bright Memory where you fight the SAI soldiers, the system works as intended, like a standard FPS. This dramatically falls apart when fighting the Ancient Warriors. With the faster-paced, melee-focused enemies, you typically have to remain in the thick of action until the combat's over. There's no time for a breather, and when the adrenaline kicks in, you don't want to take that breather anyway. Enemies are numerous and relentless, meaning taking damage is bound to happen, and frequently. Unfortunately, there's very little in the way of breaking aggression and finding time to heal when it comes to enemy rooms. Boss battles, however, are a different story. Against bosses and singular enemies, passive health regeneration finds another niche with sword defense. It can still be difficult to avoid damage and heal, but being able to deflect enemy attacks can give you that recovery time, provided you can get good enough to defend yourself against the onslaught. Seeing your health regenerate as you deflect, counter, and stagger your foe can really give you the feeling of making a comeback against a tough foe, emboldening you to turn the tables. Provided you don't screw up, of course. But as I said before, regenerating health works as intended when used in tandem with cover. The problem with Bright Memory's terrain and arena layout is that there's often little to no cover, and any obstacles that can serve as cover is detrimental to player mobility until broken by the boss. Enemies are very aggressive, and almost all of them have a ranged option. Without a reliable way to break line of sight, you're basically guaranteed to take damage. On top of this, most arenas end up very literally flat, with no verticality to them. I believe I mentioned this during my gameplay, but outside of platforming, I found very little reason to jump in combat. Yes, there's the aerial exo skill and aerial sword skills, but coupled with a flat arena and unbroken line of sight, those skills just make you into a clay pigeon for them. A very stylish clay pigeon, but an easy target either way. Wall running exists in game, but there are never runnable walls in combat zones. Imagine taking a page out of Titanfall's book, then modifying it to incorporate swordplay. The potential is there. Arenas also tend to have various ammo pickups scattered around, but in a bizarre design choice, you have to look at and manually pick up the ammo. This is an even more bizarre design choice since deflecting attacks regenerates ammo, which should incentivize deflecting more in the core gameplay loop. Naturally, in a fast-paced game, this dramatically slows down the action if you need to stop, look at, and pick up ammo refills manually. There's no inventory management, so there's no need to make picking up ammo a conscious need. If anything, only special ammo needs to be a ground pickup, since when I played, I deflected often enough that I always had a steady supply of ammo. When it came to special ammo, I would spend it if I had it and restock after battle, since it was too much of a hassle to sort through piles for the ammo I wanted in the middle of battle. To bring up a game with a similar concept of high-speed FPS action with a small personal arsenal, Doom Eternal handled this very well. Doom's arenas have a variety of elevations and platforms to maneuver over and around, breaking up enemy groups and providing cover. On top of this, there are jump pads and swing bars to facilitate movement through the air, over obstacles, and creating new paths. The cherry on top is the Super Shotgun's meat hook, allowing you to grapple from enemy to enemy and swing around at various angles. Doom's terrain and mobility options mesh together to produce a high-speed, action-packed gameplay loop that is varied, manageable, and thrilling. I'm not saying that Bright Memory should copy or clone Doom, although I'd welcome a new era of Doom clones based on Eternal. But with such a good template already available, some finer notes should be taken into consideration. Calling back to the health system, Doom's healing with glory kills also feeds into the gameplay loop, incentivizing up-close aggression in order to stay alive and keep the carnage going. Again, it's not that Bright Memory has to copy Doom, but I now realize that Bright Memory pretends to have an execution mechanic. In truth, the few times an execution prompt were triggered were scripted events, and not a properly implemented mechanic. Doom's glory kills are a straightforward risk-reward system. You regain health, but you have to remain within the fray to get it. Bright Memory's executions seem like an idea that was left in and never fleshed out past that stage. Bright Memory's risk-reward does come in a different form, however. Sword deflection. Now, I have no immediate complaints with the parrying system. You can reflect projectiles, decimate enemy defense meters, relish in the sound of a perfect deflection, and on top of that, as I said, parrying restores your exo meter and ammo. I don't know how you get more bullets, but I'm not complaining. Now, in a game with similar deflection mechanics like Sekiro, enemies are typically sized larger than the player, even if only slightly. This is for the sake of visibility. It is easier to see and read the movements of an enemy to react and defend accordingly. This is also why enemy attacks are more deliberate and impractically exaggerated, for the sake of making gameplay more manageable. Bright Memory sword deflections are functionally very similar to Sekiro's, and I wholeheartedly welcome this. The problem is, Bright Memory isn't quite designed with deflection as a core mechanic like Sekiro. Enemies are numerous, aggro from far or far off and swarm you, while deflection functions more of a single opponent mechanic. Melee enemies like to rush into your face to have you take advantage of the game's melee systems. This naturally becomes a problem when their body fills your screen and you have trouble telling just what is happening. Not only are they body blocking your sight to other enemies, but it becomes difficult to read their animations and respond accordingly. So in that case, deflection should be suited for boss fights, right? Well, there's only 4 boss fights in Bright Memory, and one of those is the same guy twice. The other 2 bosses are very large. Unfortunately, even with a maxed field of view, they're still too big. They like to rush up to you and get in your face, which makes it very difficult to see which attack they're trying to use. It can be frustrating trying to read and defense against attacks that you can't see coming, despite facing the enemy. Large enemies in FPS typically function fine, because the player is meant to keep their distance. But Bright Memory tries to have a different philosophy. The fact that bosses and large enemies are so aggressive with melee combo strings means you should be encouraged to deflect them. Sometimes, due to their size, enemies will also dead-angle you. Even if you block or reflect with the right timing, their attacks hit from a side not considered defended. This is especially prevalent with ranged AoEs, where an enemy will launch an attack at an angle that can't be blocked, but the landing shockwave will still hit you from behind. These shockwaves also straight up lie to you. Their visuals make it seem like they're ground-based, but they have high vertical hitboxes that makes jumping them ineffective. Due to the animation being so low to the ground, it also makes it difficult to see the extent of their reach. On top of being nigh inescapable, these shockwaves also cannot be blocked, which means you're likely to take hits that you cannot see coming. If anything, the camera and deflection mechanics work perfectly as showcased in the boss against the Tianyu Emperor. I feel that boss fight represents everything that Bright Memory should be. The interplay between gun and sword combat, the need to deflect attacks to create openings, it all comes together to form an exemplary duel that thrives on the concept's strongest points. Unfortunately, the game suffers on every other aspect with how the mechanics seem slapped together. It's hard to have a first-person game with both functional gunplay and satisfying swordplay. The Jedi Knight series manages this by changing to a third-person perspective when using a lightsaber, but I feel this would detract from the appeal of Bright Memory to adopt that system. Speaking of Jedi Knight, there's another mechanic I haven't quite brought up yet. Force powers. Or rather, the exosuit and sword skills. While deflection works to a certain degree, these extra powers fare a good bit worse. Generally speaking, the basic inputs for EMP Blast and Tractor Beam work well enough, but the inputs for the others are much less intuitive. I've already gone over the aerial moves and how jumping feels both unnecessary and unsafe, but the other skills need to be performed while sprinting. This is such an odd input method, as sprinting only seems to activate with forward momentum. Any other direction results in a dash. The sword skills are especially bad, as a slightly wrong or early input results in the launcher slash instead of a range slash, a difference which will end fatally. Overall, all the charged moves are just too dangerous to use. In the heat of combat, their charge times are long, and they leave you vulnerable while charging, unable to fire back or move quickly. Again, with flat arenas, there's no such reprieve to even consider using them. If I may make a suggestion, I would take another page from Sekiro and map skills to a 2-button combination. Maybe guard and sword for a sword skill, or guard and exo for a different exo skill. They can still be charged for a level 2, but reduce the charge time to make them viable. I'd say this would make skills more intuitive and consistent compared to the current layout. The other problem with these skills are their usefulness and power. They're already difficult to use, but often their damage just doesn't seem worth it. With the normal SAI soldiers, most anything will take them out, even on revenge difficulty, so it practically seems like overkill to use anything that isn't a firearm. But against the ancient warriors, well, they can withstand a lot of damage. Normally, both EMP Blast and Tractor Beam feel very strong. Both will immediately remove an enemy from the fight temporarily, if not outright. Unless, of course, the enemy simply decides to not be affected. Against shielded enemies, neither power seems to do anything, not even weaken their defenses. It should go without saying, this just feels bad. I'm not saying EMP Blast or Tractor Beam should hard counter shields automatically, but to see a blast reduce a soldier to mist, only to have a wooden shield completely shrug off all of the damage, is just simply inconsistent, and makes you question the reliability of these skills. This is especially felt against the Riot Shield soldiers. Their shields are bulletproof, meaning their defense is broken when deflected. I don't know why that's built that way, but that's how it is. Using a power to damage the shield would feel right, just blast it away. But for some reason, that's the wrong option. The shield is unaffected. Honestly, because of how difficult I found to use the skills, I didn't end up using them in the long run, and every time I did use them, I just felt their reliability drop. Looking back on it, there may have been times where the powers could have been useful, maybe even against some bosses with mobs, but up to those points, the game basically taught me to not depend on them. Now, I said it was a problem that enemies could shrug off powers, but in reality it's worse. They shrugged off a lot. I don't mean they had a lot of health. Well, the ancient warriors did have a lot of health, but I'm assuming that was due to difficulty, not quite design. I meant that enemies inconsistently stagger and falter. I vividly recall hitting an archer in the face with a sniper shot 3 times. The only reaction he had was when the last shot emptied his health bar. Otherwise, he kept firing arrows at me without pause. The fact that a basic enemy like that wouldn't even stagger to headshots, to sniper headshots, just seems so bafflingly bad. It feels like the enemy wasn't programmed to react. Things like enemies recoiling from damage probably isn't even something people would notice happening. It's sort of how things go in games. But people absolutely notice when enemies totally ignore taking significant damage. Special ammo causes enemies to stagger, yes, but that's actually on the opposite side of the spectrum. The shotgun, handgun, and sniper special ammo is actually too effective at causing stagger, enabling continuous stunlock of even bosses. That sort of imbalance is what causes the powers to feel even weaker in comparison. Otherwise, the sword and deflections cause rather consistent stagger, but that feels more like it works as intended. So, I've left this bit toward the end because it's a bit more variable in terms of experience. I don't know if these problems are non-issue on lower difficulties, or worse on the hardest, but I've mentioned enemy aggression throughout every part of this. The reason being that enemy aggression is tied to how each of the previous mechanics and aspects function. Enemy AI on revenge difficulty is both odd and disappointing. Yes, enemies should be more aggressive, firing and pursuing more, but they should not be immediately aware of my position the moment I enter a zone. Part of the problem. There's so much no from that one. I'm glad shotguns work, because the assault rifle was not giving it to me.
Grenade!
Did you just flashbang me? More so, they should not be firing and hitting me before I've even loaded in and gained control of my character. This shows up numerous times, from new zones to tutorials to boss battles. There would be gunfire before the game fully faded in, all focused on me from enemies that I couldn't even possibly see or feasibly be seen by. If anything, it's good that health regenerates, because without it, there's a chance you'd be checkpointed at a bad spot and die before the game decides you can even play. What makes this both hilarious and jarring is the required stealth segment present in the middle of the game. In normal gameplay, there's no option for stealth approach to zones, and with how hyper-aware enemies are, there's no possibility for it either. Then suddenly the enemies have a hard time detecting you, making the segment stand out even more. While I admit the stealth section is surprisingly functional compared to others that I've seen, it is still obviously tacked on. But seriously, if you're going for a high-intensity action game, don't mix in irrelevant segments for the sake of mixing it up or something. If I need a break from the action, I can take a break from the game. You don't need to enforce that on me. To avoid getting sidetracked, it is odd that there's a sniper rifle option in your arsenal when stealth simply isn't possible. The point of a sniper rifle is to deal long-range critical damage while still undetected. Instead, since enemy starting position is irrelevant, there's basically never a chance to execute a preemptive strike. Some enemies are even set to spawn behind you, meaning you can't take them out before they surround you. I don't know if it was because of the chaos of the firefight, or if there's simply no cue, but I could not hear an enemy appear and approach from behind, which simply feels like malicious game design. Now, not everything is purposefully malicious. A lot of small issues are just oddities that manage to make it into the end product. It's these bugs that really give the impression of an unfinished product, however. One of the more notable bugs was the bullet animation not properly colliding with objects. An enemy would fire, the bullet would be stopped by an object, but the tracer animation would still pass through, making it look like the bullet just went through. I don't think there's even an audio cue for when the bullet hits an object, to the point that I wasn't sure if the bullets were actually over-penetrating or not. Also, I don't really know whether it's a bug or just user error, but some QTEs just don't seem to respond sometimes. Notably the first one to eject the plane.
Everything is fine for the moment. No issues. Begin preparations for descent. Descend. What? I hit the button though.
I've seen several people inexplicably fail the very first action in the game, including myself. I also did manage to get stuck behind an invisible wall, and I have no idea how I did that or how to replicate it. I haven't worked in QA though, so, don't blame me for not testing harder. Okay. I've been wanting to address this for a while. All the issues I've brought up are present throughout the game, but most of them are also present and exemplified in the final boss, the Six-Armed Emperor. If the first encounter with the Tianyu Emperor is exemplary of how the game should be, the Six-Armed Emperor is everything the game should avoid. The boss is extra large and likes to glide up to your face. Several of his attacks have similar looking tells. Some attacks can dead angle you with little in the way of avoiding it. It can summon additional enemies to crowd and harass you. The summons can be present simultaneously. The arena is entirely flat and open. I'm not even getting into whether or not the powers would work on it or its summons. I would actually argue the boss has too much projectile variety, since in addition to that, it can teleport to and away from you, meaning there shouldn't be an issue with zoning the boss anyway. With the amount of projectiles the boss has, close combat isn't much better. Aside from a variety of sword combos that can be tough to read up close, several moves leave lingering flames which can deal damage even if the attack was deflected. It really makes staying in hard even if you're good at defense. The short of it is, it's not that the boss has too varied a moveset, it's that it uses that full moveset too liberally, without manageable intervals. Like most of the game, the boss simply throws a lot at you and expects you to simply deal with it, instead of playing up a back and forth rhythm that is typically present in action games. Quickly changing gears for a second, I'm appending this onto the end in an interest of not rewriting everything that I've already gone over. Besides, it all still holds true for Bright Memory Infinite. Interestingly, the original Bright Memory Episode 1 is a different sort of beast. The Light Blade and EMP powers are largely the same, but there's no deflections, no tractor beam, the sniper rifle isn't present, and the handgun isn't a machine pistol. There aren't any special ammo types either. Now, although there was the controversy of stolen assets for some enemy models, the enemy variety is much wider. There are beasts and monsters in addition to the soldiers and ancient warriors. Even the slow-mo effect when killing critical enemies feels better in Episode 1 than Infinite, which feels more like the game is dropping frames, rather than a stylish camera effect. While Episode 1 is dramatically shorter than the already short Infinite, I actually think it functions as an overall better game. Initially, I had problems with the long startup for EMP, but after unlocking Time Freeze and Lightning, I learned that the startup was for selecting which power to use. I actually like this input method way more than the one used in Infinite. The sword abilities are much easier to use too. While I understand the change in input style, personally, I prefer having weapon scrolling on the wheel, so relegating sword skills to it still feels kinda weird. I do think it worked fairly well. I think Infinite would benefit from activating a similar blade mode where you put away your gun and change controls to act as sword abilities. But with the addition of deflection, I can see how a more seamless sword use system was called for. Dashing also feels more effective in Episode 1, with a visible cooldown and further distance traveled than in Infinite. On the other hand, double jumping is a less intuitive hold instead of a double tap, which Infinite changed for the better. No wall running or sliding until Infinite, so that's another change for the better. Episode 1 has a combat grapple, while Infinite replaces it with a tractor beam. Ideally, I'd like to have both, since while they both have similar utility, they can have dramatically different functions. If I had to choose one, I'd go with the grapple, though it'd need to be more refined like Doom Eternal's Super Shotgun or Apex Legends Pathfinder. Both Episode 1 and Infinite have regenerating health, but Infinite added in a visible health bar. Honestly, this seems more like a neutral change, as it's not very necessary. But the arena layout feels much more varied in Episode 1 than in Infinite, which means the health system works better. There's some more cover, and enemies seem easier to break up. Overall, the powers felt more varied, useful, and usable in Episode 1 compared to Infinite. At the very least, I used them more in the hour I played Episode 1 than I did in all 4 hours of Infinite. EMP serves the same function in both games, although to me, Episode 1's feels more generally effective. Time Freeze creates a stationary bubble that effectively removes enemies within it from combat, much like the EMP, but because it lingers, it basically functions as area denial and an insurance that you will not be attacked from that direction. Lightning also functions as area denial, but in this case, it's more for area damage than crowd control. Meanwhile, sword abilities are the same, but are more easily accessible. I'm sure Son of Infinite's abilities can fill similar functions, but their prohibitive charge times prevented me from trying them out. Oh, and I didn't even bring up the style meter. It's a simple one that just goes up as you deal damage, but that sort of subtle encouragement letting you know you're dealing damage and avoiding hits is a welcome feature that was tragically lost in Infinite. I said this in my playthrough, but between the two, I'd rather have a Bright Memory Episode 2 rather than Infinite. I'm actually glad I played Episode 1 second, because I think I would have enjoyed Infinite way less knowing what was changed and lost. Okay, back to Bright Memory Infinite proper. I want to like the game. I had a blast with the first hour. I want to support the game. I will support the game. It's just very much still a work in progress. It's an inspired work for sure, but it needs a bit more consideration in how the inspirations are welded together to work properly. I do think Bright Memory has a potential to find the formula to being the FPS sword action hybrid game. It just needs a lot more polish, a lot more refinement. The things I want to see improved in future work, whether it's Bright Memory or a new idea entirely, are improved level and arena design with more combat mobility options. Bring back the combat grapple mechanics, maybe to enemies launched by EMP blasts, if not every enemy. I want to see more wall running and sliding, both for combat and platforming. I'd like to see more powers, more skills, more enemies that fit first-person sword fighting. I'd also like to see the return of powers from Episode 1, particularly Release Limit, Time Freeze, and Light Barrier. I want to see more awesome dual bosses like the Tianyu Emperor, elite sword-fighting mini-bosses, more thoughtfully balanced enemy encounters. I'd also like a story that, well, exists. Some games I play for the story, others I don't, but it'd be real nice to have effort put into that as well. Neither Episode 1 nor Infinite had a story worth mentioning, but the mystery and intrigue behind Episode 1 felt more appealing to me. I want more, and I want it to not be broken.